He waited until they walked through the front door. Then he made sure they never left. One by one. They stepped inside that house, excited to spend the holidays with family, unaware they were walking into a trap set by their own blood. Not strangers, not a masked man in the night, but their father, their grandfather, a man they knew and trusted. His name was Ronald Gene Simmons, a retired military man in the quiet town of Dover, Arkansas. To his neighbors, he was a quiet recluse. To his co-workers, a man of few words, but inside his isolated home on Route 7, behind closed doors, there was fear, control, and something no one outside ever saw. December 1987, just 3 days before Christmas, he killed his wife, then his son, then his 3-year-old granddaughter. And that was just the beginning. Over the course of 6 days, as more and more family members arrived to celebrate the holidays, he murdered them too, each one, methodically, without hesitation, his daughter Sheila, her husband, their child, even the grandchildren who had just learned to walk. In total, 14 members of his own family, including 7 children under the age of 10, were wiped out, and then he left, walked into town, and opened fire on complete strangers, 2 more dead. Then he sat down in an office chair, folded his hands on the desk, and waited for the police. No remorse, no explanation, no attempt to flee. This wasn't a man who lost control. This was a man who planned every second, calculated, cold, precise, he confessed. He refused a lawyer, he demanded the death penalty, and when it was granted, he said nothing. 16 lives, gone. A family line erased, by one man, by choice. This is the true story of Ronald Gene Simmons, a father, a grandfather, a husband, and the architect of one of the most horrifying mass murders in American history. If you're drawn to deep, investigative, true crime stories, hit subscribe and stay with us as we uncover every moment leading up to the bloodshed, the why, the how, and the silence that followed. December 22, 1987. The world outside was quiet. A rural calm blanketed the wooded outskirts of Dover, Arkansas, but inside the Simmons home, it had already begun. That morning, Ronald Gene Simmons rose early. There was no visible rage, no frantic motion. He moved like a man following a list, a sequence, and the first names on that list were his wife, Rebecca, and his son, Gene Jr. He waited until the time was right, when the house was still, when he could control every variable. He shot Rebecca first, twice, once in the chest, once again to make sure. She fell beside the Christmas tree. Gene Jr. was next. Simmons didn't hesitate. He pulled the trigger, then stood in the silence. Their bodies were dragged outside behind the house. He dumped them into an open pit that had been prepared weeks before. No panic, no mess. Then came Barbara. Gene Jr.'s 3-year-old daughter. She was too small to fight, too young to understand. He strangled her, then drowned her in a water barrel, and laid her tiny body beside her father. 3 dead, and the holiday hadn't even begun. December 26th. The day after Christmas, relatives began to arrive, eager to celebrate the season together. It was the Simmons family tradition. Everyone came home. First came Sheila, Ronald's daughter. She brought her husband, Dennis McNulty, and their child, Sylvia, age 7. They had no idea that behind the smiles and hugs, their murderer was already watching. He welcomed them in, offered them drinks, helped them get settled. Then he killed them, one by one. Sheila, once the apple of her father's eye, and the victim of his incest. She was shot in the head. Dennis, another bullet. Sylvia, strangled, then held under water until she stopped moving. Their bodies were moved to the dining room, laid out neatly on coats. Then came Loretta, Simmons' daughter-in-law, her 2 children, Michael, aged 5, and Karen, just 3. He killed all 3. He greeted them like family, then eliminated them like targets. Michael tried to run. He didn't get far. He placed their bodies next to the others. The doorbell kept ringing, and Simmons kept answering. Billy, his son, showed up next, with his wife, Renata, and their child, Trey, 20 months old. Same process. Greet, wait, kill. Billy was shot in the chest, Renata in the head, Trey drowned. He took each child and held them under the water barrel until they stopped moving. 7 grandchildren, all murdered by the same hands that once held them as newborns. The house filled with death, but Simmons didn't flee. He stayed. For Savit, 2 more days. He lived among the corpses. He watched TV, ate meals, slept. The bodies were piled in the living room, covered with coats and blankets. Some were wrapped in plastic, some lay in the backyard. The smell began to spread, but Simmons didn't flinch. This was his new world, and he was its only living occupant. December 28th. He put on a coat, got into his car, and drove into Russellville, Arkansas. His targets were not random. First stop, Peel, Eddie Gibbons' law firm. There, he shot and killed Kathy Kendrick. She had once rejected his advances. Now she was dead. Then he went to Taylor Oil Company, where he had worked. He shot and wounded a man named Russell Taylor. Next stop, the convenience store. He opened fire. 2 more wounded. Final destination, Woodline Motor Freight. He walked into the office, shot and killed Jim Chaffin, a former co-worker. As police sirens grew louder, Simmons did something no one expected. He set down his weapon, sat in a chair, and waited. No resistance, no words. He looked at the officers and surrendered. 16 dead. 4 wounded. 1 man responsible. No signs of insanity, no psychotic break, just method, routine, and a mind that believed every act was justified. Ronald Gene Simmons didn't cry, didn't apologize. He confessed, in full, and said he wanted to die. He told the judge, "I deserve the death penalty. I ask that it be carried out quickly." And for once the system obliged when police entered the Woodline Motor Freight office. On December 28th, they expected a barricaded gunman, not a man sitting calmly in a swivel chair, unarmed, unmoved, silent. Ronald Gene Simmons didn't resist, didn't speak until spoken to, just raised his hands and said, "I'm the one you're looking for." At first, officers assumed he'd gone on a spur-of-the-moment rampage. Workplace revenge, a rejected lover. They believed the chaos ended in town. They were wrong. Back at the station, Simmons requested to speak to investigators. No lawyer, no hesitation. Then came the bombshell. He looked them in the eyes and said, "There are more bodies at my home, 16 in total." The room froze. The officers leaned in. Disbelief at first, then urgency. They dispatched deputies to his property on Mockingbird Hill Lane, a wooded, isolated area near Dover, Arkansas. It was around dusk when law enforcement arrived. The place looked quiet, even festive. A string of Christmas lights flickered along the eaves. A pickup truck was parked out front. And then came the smell. The front door creaked open. Inside, what they saw stopped them, cold. The living room was dark, quiet, except for a low humming noise. It was the heater, on the floor, laid out side by side. 6 adult bodies and several children. All neatly covered with coats, jackets, or plastic sheets. Each had been carefully placed. Each face was hidden. In the van backyard, more horror waited. Officers found a large trench near the clothesline, crudely dug. Inside were 3 more bodies, buried shallow, covered with barbed wire fencing, cinder blocks and trash, like discarded furniture. Near the water barrels, 2 more children, drowned, blue-lipped and bloated. This wasn't an outburst. This was ritualistic murder. And Simmons had cleaned up afterward. The home, despite its darkness, showed signs of deliberate order. Blood had been wiped from walls, shell casings had been picked up, toys and photo frames sat untouched, eerily domestic. What stood out most was the silence. No signs of a struggle, no one had screamed. They had trusted him, every one of them. For the next several days, the Simmons home became a crime scene cathedral. Investigators worked in shifts. Medical examiners labored over each corpse. It would take weeks to confirm the exact order of death. The forensic timeline began to take shape. December 22nd. Rebecca Simmons, shot twice in the chest. Gene Jr., shot once in the chest. Barbara, 3 years old, strangled, then drowned, all buried behind the house. December 26th. Sheila, Dennis, Sylvia, all shot or strangled. Loretta, Michael, Karen, method varied. Billy, Renata, Trey, same fate. 7 grandchildren, all under the age of 70, were either strangled, drowned, or shot at close range. The autopsy reports were brutal. Some children showed signs of a brief struggle, scratches on Simmons' forearms. Others appeared calmer, suggesting they were ambushed. All were likely killed within minutes of entering the house. Investigators found no sedatives in their systems. This wasn't mercy, this was cold, calculated extermination, and Simmons had taken steps to preserve the bodies, lowering the temperature inside, sealing off windows, and wrapping them tightly. He had intended to stay with them until the outside world forced his hand. At the police station, Simmons confessed everything. No tears, no excuses, just the facts, recounted with a disturbing calm. He described how he lured each family member inside, how he had prepared a barrel for the children, how he had buried his wife with his own hands. He never stumbled, never corrected himself. It was as if he had rehearsed the retelling. Detectives were stunned by his tone. He was almost proud. "They were better off," he reportedly said. "The world is an evil place. I did what needed to be done." He explained that his family had turned against him, that his incestuous relationship with Sheila had been exposed and ruined, that God had given up on him, so he took matters into his own hands. When asked why he murdered his grandchildren, he simply shrugged. No remorse, no humanity, just an empty man in a borrowed jumpsuit. The news spread fast, from Arkansas to the national headlines. Man kills 16, including entire family. The quiet town of Dover became the epicenter of American horror. Reporters swarmed the crime scene, camera crews set up outside the police department, neighbors wept, pastors spoke of evil, schools held vigils for the children. No one could believe that the same man who fixed their cars, smiled in church, waved from his porch, had executed his bloodline. Psychologists called it the worst mass family killing in American history. A father, a grandfather, a monster. People asked why no one saw the signs, but Simmons had kept everything tightly controlled. He isolated the family, abused them behind closed doors, and when the world threatened to expose him, he wiped the slate clean. In the aftermath, the town of Russellville never recovered fully. Every Christmas the memory returns, a twisted holiday massacre that ended 16 lives and sent shockwaves through the nation. When Ronald Gene Simmons walked into court, he didn't come to fight. He came to die. Simmons faced 16 counts of capital murder, each one a name, a face, a life extinguished by his own hands. Yet from the first moment he made one thing chillingly clear: he wanted no trial, no defense, no appeals, no mercy. He told the court and the world that he deserved to die, and he didn't want the system wasting any more time or money on him. I, Ronald Gene Simmons, Sr., want it to be known that it is my wish and my desire that absolutely no action by anybody be taken to appeal or in any way change this sentence. There was no strategy, no manipulation, no theatrics, just the cold certainty of a man who had meticulously planned each death, and now was ready to meet his own. The courtroom struggled to reconcile what sat before them, a man who had murdered 14 members of his own bloodline, including his wife, children, and grandchildren. Calmly demanding his own execution, the state of Arkansas had rarely seen a case so grotesque or a defendant so cooperative, yet legal systems are built on checks, not surrender. Psychiatric evaluations were ordered. The court needed to know, was he sane enough to decide his own fate? Psychologists came and went. Simmons sat motionless. He told them what they needed to hear. He was not mentally ill. He knew right from wrong. He just didn't care. The findings were unanimous. Ronald Gene Simmons was competent to stand trial and competent to waive all appeals. No remorse, no excuses, no emotion. The prosecutor delivered the facts, 16 lives taken methodically over 3 days. The defense, silent as requested. The judge, emotionless as required. The jury, unanimous as expected. The verdict, guilty on all counts. The sentence, death. He was moved to death row at the Cummins unit in Arkansas. He never filed an appeal, never accepted a lawyer's offer, never met with clergy. He passed his time in quiet solitude, just as he had built his life at Mockingbird Hill, isolated, detached, and absolutely in control. When anti-death penalty advocates tried to intervene, citing due process and ethical obligations, Simmons wrote a formal response. "To those who oppose the death penalty, I have no desire to be part of your cause." And when the day came, he made no demands, no last meal, no last visit. June 25th, 1990. He walked into the execution chamber without a word. The needle slid in. The drugs took hold. His final words were recorded clearly. Justice delayed is not justice denied. He was executed by lethal injection, the first person in U.S. history to be executed for voluntarily waiving all appeals after a death sentence. The man who once built a fortress around his family and ruled them with total control had taken that control to its final, irreversible end. No one claimed his body. He was buried in a potter's field, unmarked. For the families left behind, the wounds never closed. For the state of Arkansas, the nightmare became legend. And for America, the name Ronald Gene Simmons became etched in true crime history. Not for what he said, but for the lives he erased without hesitation, and the silence he left behind. After the killing stopped, the questions began, and they haven't stopped since. In the quiet town of Dover, Arkansas, the sound of Christmas bells never returned to Mockingbird Hill. The shock was immediate, but what followed was a much deeper wound, one that burrowed into the town's identity and collective psyche. Neighbors, classmates, co-workers, they all had to reckon with the fact that they knew these victims, that some had eaten dinner with them, waved to them at gas stations, or attended Sunday service side by side. Now, entire branches of the Simmons family tree were wiped out. One church hosted 11 funerals in a single week. There weren't enough pews, there weren't enough words. "I don't think our community will ever feel whole again," said one local pastor. This wasn't just murder, it was obliteration. The psychological damage left a scar across generations. Survivors from extended family, especially children who lost cousins and aunts, struggled with trust, nightmares, and fear. At local schools, teachers noticed sudden behavioral shifts in students who had known the Simmons children. Some refused to go outside during recess. Others asked terrifyingly mature questions like, "What if my dad goes crazy like that?" The once sleepy town became a national symbol of horror, and the people living in its shadow were left to pick up the pieces. As the national media spotlight intensified, uncomfortable questions followed. How did no one see this coming? Could someone, anyone, have stopped him? Many pointed to Simmons' military background. A man who had spent 20 years in the SAR Navy and Air Force. Simmons was described in service as orderly, private, intensely disciplined. But behind the rank and uniform, there were cracks, a brrying history of abusive behavior. Allegations of controlling his family through threats, deprivation, and fear. A man who isolated his family in the woods, denied them phone access, cut them off from the world, and no one intervened. In 1981, Simmons was under investigation for incest and fathering a child with his daughter Sheila. A scandal that forced the family to move from New Mexico to Arkansas. But no formal charges were filed. No trial, no follow-up. That should have been the red flag, one retired state investigator later admitted. But in those days, especially in small towns, you didn't question a man's authority in his household. That's where we failed. Child Protective Services had no record of visits. Local law enforcement had minimal contact. Rebecca Simmons. His wife never filed a formal complaint, possibly out of fear, possibly out of resignation. This was more than a family in crisis. It was a more systemic collapse cause of intervention. Even decades later, experts still ask, what kind of person does this, and why? Theories emerged quickly, but consensus has been elusive. One widely accepted profile paints Simmons as a classic narcissistic sociopath, a man with grandiose delusions, zero empathy, and obsessive need for control. A man who viewed his family not as individuals, but as extensions of his power. When that power was threatened, by Sheila moving out, by public humiliation, by losing control, he didn't react like a wounded father. He erased the source of humiliation. Every child, every grandchild, even his own baby. Methodically, deliberately, like a man deleting a corrupted file. Another theory suggests Simmons didn't just snap. He planned the murders years in advance. The deep isolation of Mockingbird Hill, the lack of plumbing, the dugout cesspits where bodies were later found, these weren't accidents. He was building his own prison, his own kingdom, one FBI profiler said. And when that kingdom turned on him, he scorched the earth. Still, some ask whether PTSD from the military, latent mental illness, or long-term emotional abuse within his own childhood might have contributed. But even sympathetic voices hit a wall when confronted with the facts. This wasn't the act of a confused man in crisis. This was the act of someone who killed in silence for 3 straight days, then showed no sorrow. To this day, the Simmons murders remain among the most devastating single-family annihilations in U.S. history. A staggering 16 victims, 14 of whom were direct family. The case is taught in criminal psychology courses around the world, not just as a crime, but as a phenomenon, a clinical blueprint of a family annihilator. Simmons is often cited alongside figures like John List, Chris Watts, and Mark Barton, men who slaughtered their families with premeditation and calm precision. What sets Simmons apart is the scale and the utter lack of remorse. His face appears in FBI training modules, university lectures, and textbooks titled The Anatomy of Evil and Mass Murderers, Inside the Minds. Documentaries, podcasts, and case studies return to his story not for gore but for warning. If there's a devil in a father's clothing, one criminologist wrote, his name was Ronald Gene Simmons. And what remains? A town forever changed, a graveyard filled too quickly, a case that haunts the annals of justice, mental health, and societal responsibility. The house at Mockingbird Hill was razed years ago, no markers, no reminders, just trees growing silently where horror once lived, but the memory, the questions, the silence of those 16 souls that remains forever.